Well, hello, you wonderful citizens of cyberspace, and welcome to a strange little story time. You've been asking me to read you more things, and tonight I thought I'd go off on a complete tangent and tell you about a life other than mine. I got to thinking years ago about Kurt Cobain, Nirvana, and the weirdness of lingering dead celebrity status, and it provoked this weird little story about how perhaps Kurt actually died, and who he would have been if he hadn't. So without further waffling bollocks, here comes Post Utero. Kurt Cobain smiled and relit his joint. The ocean breeze blew back his grey hair as he watched a glossy modern teenager taking endless beachfront selfies. His own face, frozen in its angsty mid-20s, was emblazoned across her t-shirt. The perennial red flannel shirt was knotted around her waist, though hers was clean and neat and ironed. He hadn't quite made his mind up about this modern form of grunge. The kids still clung, it seemed, to that sad, depressing motto, never appear naive, never try too hard, never care, not about anything, including your appearance. Except they did, these kids, they cared. They all cared so fucking much it crippled them. Hours in front of a mirror, hours sweating over a selfie stick before they went off and bought themselves thousands of Instagram followers to boost their fragile egos. All of them so painfully desperate to be famous for nothing at all, and all of them plastered in his band's logo, even when they didn't seem to realise they were the absolute antithesis of everything he'd stood for back then. Music. The music was what mattered, all that mattered, that wild unleashing of pain and frustration and alienation into a riotous, bone-smashing tidal wave of sweat and noise and sheer unbridled chaos. Who gave a fuck what your hair looked like when that was your scene? Because that had been the point, hadn't it? The scene. Finding someplace to go, someplace you didn't have to hide, someplace it was okay to be lost, to confess that you didn't understand this fucked up world you'd been dumped into, that you weren't as jaded and cool as you wanted to be, as you pretended to be, that nothing made sense and the boomers had mapped out a whole goddamn ecosystem with nowhere for you to fit in. In those packed out rooms, his anger would explode from the metal lungs of the microphone, the speakers, his screams crashing into the walls and drowning those lost skinny kids in raw shredded noise, and they'd kick a scuffed toe in the dirt, look up from under straggles of bleach and say, "Me too, me too." The music, his little tribe, that was all that had mattered, if any of it mattered at all. He'd always pretended it didn't, but in his heart of hearts he cared so much it crippled him. Didn't all teenagers, really? But the look, the style, if you could even call it that, it had been just nothing more than one giant shit sandwich accident of junk-fueled laziness and the bad hygiene of a depressed singer on a tour bus. And fame, well, all that had been was a giant unforeseen ass itch, in those days at least. But decades later, things were different, very different. His 20-something self with its matted Kool-Aid hair might have pretended to hate being hot shit, but nonetheless he'd gotten used to it. Enough that when it all changed, well, it was gutting. If you thought being famous and adored stressed you out, try being post-famous and totally loathed. When you were a rock icon who lived too long, outgrew all that violent, self-destructive stupidity and lived to actually be content, Jesus, it wasn't like you just became irrelevant and disappeared or changed lanes and found a new life to be happy in. Hell no. You were still famous, but now no one had a good or kind or even tolerable word to say about you. All it took was one bum LP to turn hot shit into rotten shit, and arguably Kurt hadn't put out anything decent since Stagnation, the explosively weird follow-up to In Utero, its cover luridly splattered with an image of a pregnant deer lying dead in the road, the curled-up, violently ejected embryo placed tenderly next to its head, still cloaked in translucent membranes. That album had undeniably had its exquisite moments, but not everyone even liked that one. It was the moment he'd turned his back on grunge and finally owned up, let himself accept the fact that he was a decent musician, that he really was here to stay, and fuck you all. This was the shit he genuinely wanted to put out there, and all that faux jaded teenage self-consciousness fell away. Self-assured dirty words be damned. In Kurt's eyes, it was the first album that really mattered because it was the only one that actually made him happy. but the first wave of reviews had been nearly suicide-inducing. That week, however, was when everything changed forever. It was one earth-shakingly disastrous night when the first gig of the tour was cancelled due to a car bomb outside the venue, a car bomb that went off, killing 3 kids. Kurt had subsequently spent the night in his hotel room just trying to fucking unwind, only to wake up in hospital with a very pale Dave informing him that he'd been officially dead for a few minutes there, and how many more of these stupid fucking ODs did he genuinely expect to survive? Didn't they have bigger things to worry about right now than their self-centered asshat of a singer going over on black tar heroin for the nth fucking time? Dave had a point, an undeniable if deeply irritating point. That night, things shifted forever. It was the event that sent him to rehab under his own steam, no longer coerced and blackmailed into it, but actually meaning it this time. Because shit, those kids had come out to see him play, and instead they'd been blown to bits in the street, dead over end of, and instead of doing fucking anything to say sorry or thank you or whatever the fuck anyone could possibly say to the world, to the kids' parents in such a fucked up situation, he'd repaid them by almost dying himself in the most stupidly predictable, pathetic way possible. So no more. No fucking no more with this shit. He was nearly 30, for Christ's sake, and he had a kid, didn't he? The stupidity wagon had to stop rolling somewhere. And then 3 weeks into rehab, he found a doctor who actually believed his stomach pain was real, not the fictitious creation of some anxious, drug-seeking hypochondriac. And instead of bombarding him with pills that may as well have been smack light, they'd performed minor surgery, given him hardcore antacids, and just like that, Kurt's life and Kurt himself, all of it was different. Outside the walls of his rehab clinic, the album reviews picked up nearly overnight. In the wake of the blown-up kids and one nearly dead Kurt, just as they'd always done, the media were ascribing deep, heavy meanings to snatches of his lyrics that honestly hadn't meant jack shit. Nothing more than bobbing olive in a martini glass words he'd snatched out of the ether when he was bored and high. But in the gruesome eyes of those eager journalists, his raw, disjointed, meaningless gore poetry had predicted the bomb, the killing of 3 disciples, and with the overdose, that near-miss brush with death, Kurt had served them up a thick, creamy double helping of angst and torture, which was precisely what everyone had always wanted to milk and milk and milk from him. Ironic, then, that Kurt was rapidly becoming the exact opposite of the fucked up depressive martyr he'd become in the minds and hearts of screwed up teens the world over. He never thought he'd be one of those goddamn rehab people, oozing with obnoxious health, claiming to be high on life itself. But, well, shit, it happened. Years and years of physical pain, self-doubt and confusion, the frustration of being perpetually misrepresented in interviews, feeling like a fraud whenever he smiled and an ungrateful sack of shit when he didn't, the bombardment of endless conflicting media madness slashing away at him and his art and his wife and his baby daughter, it all just sort of evaporated. Maybe he was finally growing up, or maybe those minutes on the hotel floor with a needle in his arm and his brain starved of oxygen had actually fucked him up so much he'd unfucked completely. Either way, he finally knew what happy was, what peaceful was. Even when he piled on 40 pounds after putting down the spoon and picking up the fork, as a fellow ex-junkie once put it. And he was endlessly ribbed by the music press, especially in Britain, where the paparazzi were the scum of the fucking earth. Even then, he really, genuinely didn't give a shit. But the ongoing music review blowjob had come to an abrupt halt after he took a 2-year hiatus, then burst back onto the scene with an album simply entitled Part 2. His fans were slavering for something, anything, after all that time away, and the album was a glorious, riotous chaos of frantic guitars and busted drums and screaming, but lyrically, it alienated his entire fan base. There were songs about sunshine and sex and the beauty of watching little Francis grow up, every word written and sung without a trace of irony or sarcasm or self-deprecating bitterness, and this apparently was a tough pill to swallow. The entire world, it seemed, gagged itself rotten on his happiness. The 2 years that had passed hadn't changed his fan base one iota. Just because Kurt was happy now, the kids who'd latched onto his music, his old music, they were every bit as miserable and faux jaded, angsty and confused as he used to be, and all they got from his new album was the belief that Kurt had sold out completely. The album and its follow-up did okay in sales terms, pretty damn well, frankly, as far as things went. But they didn't do Nirvana well. They didn't set the world alight. They didn't resonate with an entire generation and make ratty-haired 14-year-olds weep in the street. And that meant whatever steps into maturity Kurt had taken, the rest of the world clearly hadn't followed. So it went over the next decade. The sales slid down, the reviews got more scathing, the media turned him from a martyr into a joke, until finally came the moment of his great revelation. It was the revelation that would lead him to change his own legacy, and in doing so, it seemed, the entire fucking world. As Kurt sat on the beach, here, now, in this crazy new world, he was the only living being aware of the truth, of the seismic shift that had jammed the gears of fate this week, as one man fanned the wings of a tiny butterfly and ended up causing a goddamn fucking tsunami. It had all started out as a pretty normal Californian day, a morning dip in the pool with his second wife, semi-retired small-time actress Sue Jensen Cobain, then a hearty breakfast followed by a tinker around in the studio playing through his new stuff with great gusto, until it all came crashing the fuck down as his manager phoned to deliver the news that it was absolutely no go, no deal, no fucking dice as far as the new tracks were concerned. The record company flat out refused to shit all over Nirvana's legacy any more than they already had. Kurt still had the vocal power, no one doubted that, and the tunes didn't suck, but for Christ's sake, man, why have you got to start singing about Jesus? No one wants religion mashed up into angsty-sounding rock music sung by a tedious old reformed junkie. And then, to top it all off, to really fucking top it off, along came the plaintive adage that Kurt was sick to fucking death of hearing. Can't you just write something a bit more like the old stuff? A bit more like Nevermind? Would it really kill you to try? That was when he'd hit the roof, lost his shit completely. He knew full well his manager had heard it all before, but nonetheless, he'd reeled out the whole goddamn ear-bashing all over again. Look, you cynical, capitalist, soul-laxative fuck. I'm not some ball-gagged whore for you and the media and the entire goddamn uncaring, brain-dead, vacuous world to flog and flog in circles until I die over yet another repetitive pile of garbage on an LP. Of course I could jerk off to the Pixies and whack you out another tawdry, plastic, regurgitated Nevermind. Of course I fucking could. It's painting by numbers. But you know what, Joe? You know fucking what? I'm pretty happy right now, or I would be if you'd just crawl on out my asshole. Do you know how I felt back then? I was only fucking happy when I was high to fucking oblivion, usually not even then, and any one of those ODs could have been the last of me. I'm here because God willed it, and all I want to do in this goddamn album is tell my story, my real story, the good stuff, that you can come through shit like I came through, and you can end up living by the goddamn beach with a beautiful woman who understands you, and you don't need any of the drugs or the being too cool to wash your hair or the fucking... Kurt, hey, come on, Joe had interrupted in that infuriating, disgustingly patronising treacle tone that seeped into Kurt's earhole like warm slime. I know how you feel, man. I get it, okay? The new stuff is great, it really is. It's just a little out of touch with your fan base. It's not on brand, man. But we could absolutely revisit the idea of a side project, or they'd put it out like that, Kurt asked, his fury hesitating. They've changed their mind. There was a long pause, then the situation is basically the same on that front, man. Internet marketing is a great tool these days. You'd have many, many avenues to choose from. Naturally, I'd be there to put my full weight. This is complete bullshit! I've been signed to this goddamn label for decades. I've made them billions, and they still won't even have a flake of faith in me to put out this album properly. I'm fucking Kurt Cobain, Joe. If I put my new album out unsigned on fucking Bandcamp, I will be crucified by the media. I know this LP is a gamble, you asshole, but it matters to me, man. Why the fuck is it that all the music I just pissed out when I was high and never gave a crap about, all that shit dangles over my head from morning till night, but the minute I actually care, the minute I stop being ashamed to look like I'm trying, like I'm proud of what I create, you just shit right over me. You talk to me about Kurt. Hey, I know it's tough right now, but we talked about this. Don't get stressed out. Think about your blood pressure, man. Go for a walk, calm down, and look, like I said yesterday, just think about a few lyrical tweaks. You don't even have to do it yourself. We've got some great writers on team. They wouldn't screw up your whole, message. But we just need to water down the Jesus stuff a bit, make it a little more edgy. And honestly, man, with the mumble rap remix of Teen Spirit coming on so well, the album's going to fly off the shelves anyhow. It doesn't even matter if your new stuff's a bit... Kurt slammed the phone down, screamed at the top of his lungs, stormed into the kitchen to take an extra beta blocker, then strode out of the house in the most flaming huff a marginally overweight 53-year-old man in cargo pants was capable of. He considered going for an angry walk for all of about half a second, but the sun was beating down, he was completely out of shape, and no amount of fury was worth ending up 2 miles from home, a sweaty fat man with blisters on his feet. So instead he got in the car and drove around listening to the battering fury of a Christian band called the Shepherds, who didn't really preach the word of God, but instead just shrieked about how fucking awful the world was now no one believed in anything. He drummed on the steering wheel while howling along with the band. No lessons to be learned, into ash our souls have burned. The road we walk down has no signs, aborted, torn from the divine. War-marked bullets for our morality, minds too small to grasp eternity, lives that choke the throats of heaven, a clock that ticks forever 11. Have we created hell? Do we punish ourselves for those that fell? For what? For what? Free will we took and none were saved. We run through Eden, yet call ourselves enslaved. He was driving faster and faster as he screamed along, wondering why in fuck these total nobodies got to sing about whatever they liked, on a record label no less, but if he chose to do so, he'd be on fucking Bandcamp, amidst all the 12-year-olds picking out 2-chord songs about the time their mom hadn't let them go to that party and in doing so had ruined their lives. By the time the album was finished, he realised he'd meandered right into the street where his weed dealer lived. Weed might be legal now, theoretically speaking, sold in dispensaries all over town, but Kurt refused to set foot inside one of those fucking places. Just like taking high-quality tan powder over shitty but familiar black tar heroin once had, it felt all wrong. Kurt was a creature of habit, weed was comforting, and a large part of its comfort for him was how familiar it felt. Pulling up in a dodgy neighbourhood to score something illicit made him feel at home, and that was the whole point, wasn't it, of drugs? As he riffled through his wallet for the cash, he thought back to the great heroin conundrum of the 90s, on tour across the East Coast, when he'd first been offered that fantastic yet alien dope, that soft, fluffy tan powder in its cute little logo-stamped envelopes. You could even snort it if you didn't have your works with you. How's that for convenience? But he'd hated the shit regardless. It might be better, technically, but the comfort factor, the familiarity, the ritual, it was completely gone. Without the incense pong of black tar melting into filthy goop, it was a waste of time and money and fucking brain cells. That weird East Coast dope wasn't dark enough in the needle, for one, and it didn't smell the same. Black tar was repulsive, but it was comfortable. Black tar was a friend when you needed one. God, black tar was just so fucking shit. Why was he thinking about this? Why the fuck were his brain cells swimming with the placebo memory stench of black tar heroin melting in a battered, charred bottle cap, willingly summoned up by his rebellious brain cells? One bust up with his manager and now he was sitting in his dealer's street thinking about dope. It wasn't a good sign, not good at all. Weed. Weed was the thing. Weed was safe. It tranced you out just a bit, gave you good ideas, put a smile on your face, and it never killed a soul. If you liked your life, you stuck with weed. Think about that. Think about doing it properly, doing it illegally. Look around you at the sun-baked street, the shitty little houses, the teenagers hanging out sweating on the streets with their pit bulls panting in the sun. Dispensaries made weed so pharmaceutical, so horribly white-collar and middle-aged. Visiting a scruffy dealer in a house covered in bong water stains and trippy wall hangings, well, that was like crawling back into the womb. Score some weed, he instructed himself. Go to the beach, smoke until you don't give a shit about Joe and Bandcamp and Dave having a total midlife crisis and wanting to start his own band with a stupid name, the fucking Food Wrestlers or whatever that shit was. Then go home, make love to your wife, call your daughter, and remind yourself there's more to life than that asshole record label. And if you think about smack one more fucking time today, you clearly need a goddamn vacation. Scowling, he got out of the car, slammed the door, and strode up to John's paint-peeling house. He was ushered down the hallway by a wasted-looking girl with short pink hair in bunches, wearing nothing but jeans, a yellow bra, and a 90s rave candy necklace. She beckoned at him with a dopey grin, and he stepped onto the grimy old rugs of the living room, gratefully inhaling the scent of fresh, pungent bud and unwashed socks. John was sprawled out on the faded, tatty sofa, dripping clear liquid onto a large sheet of blotter paper, adorned with swirling purple and green artwork. He glanced up, grinned, and said, "Kurt, dude, you want in on this shit, man? Last batch sold out in a single weekend, and this stuff's even better. We dropped some last night, and fuck me, talk about a fresh perspective. I ditched the party, stayed up all night painting, and it got to me thinking about you. You're an artist too, man. I wouldn't be living if I didn't offer you some of this shit. You in? A fresh perspective, Kurt thought, staring at the wet drops of liquid LSD seeping into the swirling blotter paper. Isn't that exactly what I need? It's not like anyone gets hooked on LSD. It just reminds you what's important. And it's a beautiful fucking day. A beautiful fucking day, and I feel like shit. That's all wrong. Maybe having my brain flipped upside down for an afternoon is exactly what I need. And so it came to be that 3 hours later, Kurt was sitting on a secluded stretch of beach shaded by a bright orange sun umbrella, his brain melting into the freshest perspective any human had possibly experienced in the history of time itself, having eaten both tabs at once and chased them down with a big fat smoke. He wasn't quite sure right now whether he regretted that decision. Words like regret and decision had sort of melted away entirely, until all that was left was the vast cornflower blue expanse of the sky and the giggle-inducing softness of the warm white sand beneath his fingers, the regular sploshing of the waves and the horizon that seemed to wibble and wobble and curl up in a ball until the entire world whirled itself up around him, and it was intense. It was a lot. It was quite possibly eating him alive and taking him somewhere he'd never return from. But for now, all he could do was bury his fingers deeper in the soft, warm sand and laugh at the blue-on-blue horizon as it danced a mad, salty acid conga, and then... For the briefest second, that scene from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas ran through his mind. A hotel bathtub, a fat man, grapefruits bobbing weirdly in the water, and that phrase... The next phase would likely be a hellishly intense introspective nightmare, 4 hours or so of blistering terror. It wasn't word perfect, but it slurred through his mind in Johnny Depp's cigarette-clamped sideways Hunter S. Thompson drawl. The phrase repeated 7 times over like a skipping record, until Kurt wasn't noticing the sand and the sea and the beauty anymore. He was noticing his own body stretched out in front of him. His t-shirt had ridden up to reveal the grey hairs scattered across his rotund midriff, and at the end of his legs his feet were encased in white socks and Jesus sandals, and all he could do was stare at his own feet, at his own stomach, as though he'd never seen them before in his entire life, because who the fuck was this person he was wearing? Who the fuck was this middle-aged body he was riding around in like some weird telepathic passenger? This couldn't be him, could it? When the fuck did he start wearing white socks with orthopedic sandals? When your knees started hurting in normal shoes, replied a strange echoing voice from the distant depths of the ocean. Converse trainers are very unforgiving on the joints, you know. Oh, Christ, Kurt groaned, attempting to sit up to shift his visual perspective, but all that happened was that the soft sand swallowed his arms entirely, and one of those hideous alien legs flailed bizarrely into the sky, and then the ocean crashed a deafening crash, and suddenly the alien socks on his aging, creaky feet became just the tip of the iceberg, the beginning of the ride, and now his entire brain was whooshing, rushing, sloshing down the LSD waterslide from hell, memory after memory assaulting him, bad reviews that were scalded into his mind forevermore. The phrase sell out flashed past in neon lights, followed by dad band, uncool, ill, you listen to Nirvana. The neon kept flashing, and now the audio track synced in as Joe the manager's voice boomed out like the words of God himself, berating Kurt's latest lyrical efforts, denouncing his attempts to tell his story, his truth, pleading with him to accept the fact that no one would ever care about him again unless he pissed out a phony return to the miserable 90s grunge slush pile, ideally paired with a massive dope relapse that would see him losing 40 pounds and hopefully slashing his arms up on stage with a broken bottle, Sid Vicious style, because that was what the world wanted, Kurt. It's what the world wants, boomed the voice of Joe God. Tragedy and angst and near-death experiences. You're too happy, Kurt. You sold out, Kurt. We only own your soul now. A record deal is a deal with the devil, and he will make you dance to the mumble rap remix of Teen Spirit until you... No! Screamed the chubby greying man at the distant edge of the beach, flailing haplessly about on his beach towel as though invisible creatures were attacking him from all sides. No, Joe, leave me alone. I won't do it. I'll never do it. The teenage lovers, witnessing this display of rampant middle-aged insanity from the distant sand dunes, laughed, shook their heads and carried on making out. Which was fortunate, because otherwise they might have seen the writhing figure of an aging Kurt Cobain disappearing into a sudden blast of spooky-looking green ectoplasm. Kurt found himself standing in what appeared to be an enormous, luxurious tent, the kind you saw in old movies about ancient battles, those great white billowing things holding the beds of the Sultan and his harem. Only this particular tent housed numerous pot plants, the likes of which Kurt had never seen on Earth, with softly waving suckered tentacles and undulating purple berries. There were 3 curving purple velvet couches, a few gleaming guitars leaning against their backs, and as Kurt turned round, he realised he wasn't alone. Morgan Freeman himself was standing behind him, beaming beatifically, his hand clasped behind his back. "Hello," said Morgan Freeman, in that voice like slow sunset honey. "It's real nice to meet you at last. You were a hard nut to crack. The sobriety really took, didn't it?" Kurt blinked 3 times and said, "What?" "Oh, now, I'm sorry, that was terribly impolite, wasn't it? I assumed you must have viewed the movie which starred this earthly body in my place, but perhaps you didn't." Morgan Freeman paused a moment, then nodded decisively and said, "No, you did. You watched the movie several years ago. You just don't believe yet. And that's quite all right. I'm used to non-believers, whatever form I take, and you really are on a lot of acid right now. So I felt that this form might be kinder to you than if I were to appear as an extraterrestrial, or a 12-foot woman with 8 arms, or any of my other favourite forms. I really did like this mortal's portrayal of me, so in the times that I need to appear friendly, I take this particular form, this vessel, so to speak. Kurt Cobain, my usual name, is God. Welcome to my intermediary kingdom. I've been wanting to meet you for quite some time." "You're God," Kurt stammered as Morgan Freeman turned that slow, beatific smile on him again, holding his hand out in front of his face and examining it. It seemed quite solid and real, no traces, nothing that would suggest he was still tripping balls, and yet his new surroundings were utterly undeniable. The tent, the crazy plants, and above all, that was most assuredly Morgan fucking Freeman. What the fuck? What the fucking fuck? God reached out and shook Kurt's trembling hand before inviting him to take a seat and informing him that he had quite the intriguing offer to make today. As Kurt sank shakily onto a velvet couch, God said, "Now then, Kurt Cobain, what I have to tell you essentially boils down to worship. I like worship very much, in fact, and to me it matters not what is being worshipped, so long as it's good and held dear to the worshipper. Because you, Kurt Cobain, were made to be worshipped. And I think you know that. I hear it in your frustration day after day as you argue with your manager. You have glorious songs and a me-given talent to sing them, but the world simply won't let you be worshipped as you should be. But you can be, and you will be, in the new world I have devised for you, assuming you are willing to undertake one small but challenging task. There is a perfect place and time for certain events to occur. After that, you can be exactly who you want to be, and Kurt Cobain can be exactly who I want him to be." "Aren't we the same person?" Kurt asked, frowning. "Not necessarily," said God with a slight smile, "and I think you know that, don't you? Every day on the phone with your manager Joe, he wants you to be Kurt Cobain, the jaded, bitter, miserable singer of Nevermind and In Utero. You want to be Kurt Cobain, enlightened soul who came through hell and now wants to sing about the glories of my earthly kingdom. And Joe, or the rest of the world, in fact, will not let you be both. The world cannot handle you being both, and I think you know that. So, Kurt, let me be honest here. I have seen your future, and it is not pretty. The stress is going to put you in the ground before too long, and the legacy you leave behind will be tepid at best. Those heavenly songs so recently penned, You will never be heard outside the walls of your studio, the walls of your mind. But this does not have to be the way things go. I am, as mentioned, God. And nothing is beyond my reach. I can split you, Kurt Cobain, into the two people you and I both know you are. There is a way for young Kurt to be preserved and worshipped forever, and new Kurt to live the life he so desperately wants. Are you ready to hear my master plan? Kurt said yes. What the hell else was there to say given the circumstances? God explained. And God had a hell of a way with words. As crazy as it all sounded, pretty soon Kurt was convinced, on board. It wasn't as though he didn't already loathe his morose, ungrateful younger self. He was pretty sure he was up to the task God was setting him. He was ready to be free of that asshole, ready to walk in his own liberated footsteps, not be haunted forever by the sullen lump he'd been as a 20-something kid. So he agreed to God's terms, and the next thing he knew, he was standing in the house he hadn't seen in decades, the one that had gone to Courtney in the divorce, the one she'd OD'd and died in. That was after he got clean and she couldn't stand it, called him smug, fell deeper and deeper into her own addiction as if in rebellion against everything he was saying. And then when custody of Frances was taken from her, the heartbreak and heroin killed her. But God had said Courtney would get to live in this new world. Frances would have a mother, and Frances needed one, badly. Every girl did, didn't they? As Kurt stood in the hallway of that old house, he delved in the heavy canvas bag at his side and found, as promised, the cold lead weight of the gun and the pre-written suicide note, which he paused to read. Maudlin, incoherent, martyr complex shite. It was perfect. He went down to the basement where he'd been assured he would find his younger self, and so he did. Slumped in a heap, high on black tar. God, the kid looked so young, so skinny. What a fucking tragic waste of his youth. How many hours a day had he spent asleep back then? But it wasn't really asleep, was it? Whispered an insidious little voice inside his mind. It wasn't really asleep. It was bliss. Pure, true, beautiful bliss. And for a moment, Kurt hesitated. He hadn't been this close to black tar and a needle in decades, and this was a fucked up situation, wasn't it? The kind of fucked up situation a person might be excused one tiny little dabble in. His palms were sweating. His younger self was slumped over just feet away, the needle right next to him, another decent rock of tar sitting in the tin that was once so familiar. And now what? He was meant to put a bullet in that kid's brain? Wouldn't a little tiny taste make it easier? I mean, if killing your own kid self didn't count as an excuse for a dabble, he didn't know what did. Don't you even think about it, boomed out a voice inside Kurt's mind, the voice of Morgan Freeman, the voice of God himself, and Kurt jumped awkwardly backwards, whispering, shit, sorry. And then he felt even worse because he'd just sworn at the Almighty, and wasn't this the weirdest day of his entire fucking life? Get on with it, man, said the voice of God, sounding mildly amused, and Kurt knew he was forgiven for the swearing. He tried to remember everything God had told him, that he would be worshipped if he did this, that he would get to be himself if he did this. He could put out his new songs properly on a record label and they would sell, and he wouldn't be strapped to this useless junkie and his miserable songs anymore. Kurt crouched down in front of the kid on the floor. Young Kurt was splayed out on his back, ripped jeans, Converse trainers, tangled blonde hair hung over his thin young face. Old Kurt felt a spasm of wholly justified loathing. Every single daily argument with Joe was because of this little twerp. This little twerp who hadn't even lived half his life yet, but he'd already written songs that would taken over the world, and now Kurt couldn't sell anything that didn't sound like the maudlin bathtub flatulence of this smacked-out little tosser on the floor. God, if anyone deserved to die, if anyone deserved to be killed by his own hands, it had to be this cretin. Kurt Cobain pulled out the gun, clicked off the safety, and pointed it at the temple of his younger self. He took 2 deep breaths. His younger self opened bloodshot, ice-blue eyes and stared muddily up at him. Old Kurt squeezed closed the same clear-souled blue eyes and convulsively pulled the trigger. The echoes of the gunshot sounded far, far away from that dreadful place. Kurt was sitting at a computer in the very same celebrity mansion he'd woken up in that morning, but the decor was vastly different. There were glitzy photos of his wife, Sue, on the walls, parading in designer dresses down red carpets, Kurt looking smart but understated at her side. There were Oscars on shelves. Best Actress caught his eye. Apparently Sue was taking Hollywood by storm now that young Kurt was dead, but who the fuck did that make him? There was a wallet lying on the desk in front of him. Kurt picked it up, thumbed through to the driving license. Billy Macron, it read, with a picture of himself right next to it and a guitar pick tucked into the lining, as if to reassure him that he hadn't completely lost everything he'd ever been. Kurt went to Google, searched up his new name. It turned out that his storyline ran much the same as it ever had, minus the early fame. Small-time junkie rock star in his youth who'd hit rock bottom, turned it around, found Jesus and gotten clean, which was precisely the thing that had shot him to fame along with meeting his present wife. He was signed to a respectable medium-sized record label and they were putting out his songs. A new album was being recorded right now, according to the internet. And just as he read up on this, a mobile phone burbled in his pocket, caller ID, Bo. Kurt said, "Hey," and let the guy speak. He didn't understand everything this Bo said, but the gist of it was beautiful. It was freedom, complete and utter creative freedom. The songs Kurt was so passionate about, they could finally be released into the wild, flying free. It was fucking gorgeous. 2 hours later, he was back at the beach, out to witness this new world for himself. And there she was, the girl with the red flannel shirt knotted around her waist, wearing her modern approximation of the makeup of his old grunge era. His young dead face splattered across her t-shirt as she took endless selfies. Christ, thought Kurt as he took a drag on his joint and the weed seeped its vibrant green tendrils into his brain. This is bizarre. None of them give a shit about me really, or they wouldn't if they knew the truth. Nirvana the dad band. Kurt the embarrassing fat dad man, sober and dull and happy, that ultimate dirty word. Kurt Cobain in his horrible smelly t-shirts and jeans that ripped after they were bought. Embarrassing dad man dresses like a tramp, sells out grunge in his big fat 30s with all those terrible happy albums he never should have made. It's cool to be bored, but it's never cool to be boring. Except, Jesus, I don't know. I wrote them the most boring narrative on earth, didn't I? Young, dumb, junkie fuck-up writes a few miserable songs and then tops himself. Who could have ever predicted that? But somehow, even decades later, the perpetual tides of hormone-drenched, angst-ridden kids are still gobbling it up like fucking ambrosia, still weaving crazy meanings from the bullshit poetry I don't even remember writing. Just nod and smile, pretend you meant it, whatever it is. Pretend you were ever that deep. And the world worships at the altar of the dumbest, laziest myth in the world forever and ever. Fuck, man, I wasn't even being serious, was I? None of us were. It was all so goddamn half-assed, making up words that kinda rhymed or screaming nonsense in wasted practice sessions and Dave going, yeah, that works, man, do that. And then 6 months later, the whole world all up in my face about what does it mean? What does it all mean? When fuck, I didn't know what anything meant back then, did I? I didn't know that every word I ever said was going to get polished up like a dogshit diamond for all eternity. But only the miserable words. You ever notice that? Any clip anyone ever took of me joking around, they had no use for those. It's like someone deliberately erased every time I ever smiled, even at my own goddamn kid, because all they ever wanted from me was miserable martyr Jesus, man. Even now, even fucking now, man. He's been dead longer than he's been alive, and they're still at it. Is it hilarious, or is that just goddamn sad? They're all so serious these days, kids. Those crazy fucking online arguments they have about me and my death and some dude who died before they were even born, and there they are screaming till they internally hemorrhage when I bet they wouldn't even get that pissed if someone insulted their own mother. No more embarrassing dad man now, hey? Wonder if I'll get made into a gold statue someday. Better never admit that I'd like one. That's the embarrassing dad man talking, and he's dead now. He has to be. Fuck me, this world takes some getting used to. There was no more embarrassing dad man now, literally. What a weird and wonderful life, Kurt thought. When he Googled his daughter, she was no longer his daughter, but that wasn't what mattered. She was doing better, she was even singing. And she didn't sound like him or like Courtney. She was her own goddamn person. How could he argue with that? And Courtney, by some miracle, she was still alive too, which made him smile in spite of all the old bitterness between them. Francis had a mother, however chaotic. It made him happy, sort of. The glorification of his youthful angst and misery made his skin fucking itch, but maybe he could rectify that somehow in his songs, his new ones. Now he had the freedom to say whatever he liked. Could he still change the world from afar? Or had he created a monster he could never go back and truly kill? Unless his dealer had some more of that acid. As he watched the flannel-shirted girl go click, click, clicking her selfies, he felt a violent stab of the old self-hatred and wondered if he could go back and take out Kurt in the womb. It's just self-loathing, man, he thought. That's all it is. You wanted to be respected as a musician now and then. That's what you got. You can hardly complain. You're the most famous musician on earth, even if no one knows you're actually him. That night he talked to Sue about it all in the guise of a dream about Kurt Cobain. She rolled her eyes and said, "Again? You're always dreaming that you killed him, or that you were twins, or that you were on stage singing his songs. I never get the fixation personally, but I guess I understand it. You lived similar lives, Billy, but you lived, you learned, and he just lost himself to self-doubt. Why would you dream about being him? He should dream about being you." Then she kissed him and closed her eyes. "Even though I'm an embarrassing dad man?" Kurt asked. Sue just laughed. "Would you rather be dead at 27? Never known happiness? Never beaten your demons? Never met me? You're exactly who you're meant to be, Bill." "You're more right than you even know," said Billy Kurt as he lay down to dream about his newfound creative freedom, the millstone of nirvana, of teen spirit, no longer hanging around his fucking neck. And that's how it ends. And therefore it is probably about time for me to do a fuck off and leave you to do whatever you're doing. Maybe go to bed after this huge bedtime story. I did launch into a giant waffling on the end of this video about this story and why I wrote it and why I felt these things about who older Kurt might have ended up being and all of that. But I felt this video was already long enough and it was quite jarring. So I've just sliced it all off. Maybe I'll leave a little bit of a waffle in the comments about my thoughts regarding all these things. Maybe not. I don't know. The only thing I do have to state is that although older Kurt is very scathing and very nasty about younger Kurt, that is not coming from me. I love Nirvana and Kurt Cobain. It's wild watching interviews of him. Like his mannerisms, the way he looks, the way he speaks is so similar to someone I loved a lot when I was younger that it's very strange. It's fascinating watching him because he's so similar. But I loved them as a teenager. I still love them now. I just think if you were in this position whereby your younger self had been a raging success and now everything you did, even in your 50s, right? You've been alive for double the length of time this guy had. But even in your 50s, you're being expected to do the stuff you were doing in your 20s. And everyone's saying, we want the old Kurt back. We want the old Nirvana back. You'd hate your younger self. So I felt, let's put that in there. But I didn't realize it would come off as so scathing until I recorded it out loud. And I was like, oh, this sounds so nasty. So I love Nirvana. Don't leap all over me. But I do find dead celebrity status and the way that particularly younger people who, they were born after the guy died and they're still so vehemently into this band. And I do think a lot of it has to do with Kurt's passing. I mean, you look at all the other grunge bands of the era who no one died in and people don't really care about them today. Nirvana is really the one grunge band that people give a shit about. And I do think Kurt Cobain's passing is a big part of it. Just like, you look at the stuff surrounding Amy Winehouse or Lil Peep or anyone who's died young, people just go crazy. It just changes your perspective of the whole band. And then you've got bands like Aerosmith who, and Steven Tyler, who obviously, did not die young. And, people look at Aerosmith now as just kind of like a dad band. And I feel that is who Nirvana would be if he was still alive. I think they would have probably faded into obscurity. There wouldn't be this magic surrounding them. Kids would not be poring over old Nirvana stuff if Kurt Cobain was alive as, this like chubby old graying like dad dude. I don't think people would be hardcore into them because, he would be alive. He probably would have put out more music that might have trashed their legacy. He did say in numerous interviews, we're done with grunge kind of thing after In Utero. And that kind of makes me think like, I don't know if someone bumped him off. I don't really believe that Courtney did it, but I do think there was a lot of suspicious stuff surrounding his death. And with the way he was planning to change the band's direction, did a music producer or someone like that hear his new stuff and think, you are about to trash your legacy, you're about to ruin this, we could make a hero out of you, we could make so much money off you if you were dead. The death clause, did that come into it? I don't know, but I think it's interesting to think about, and I'm surprised it's taken me until now to write and finish this story. Actually, I started writing this story years ago. So anyway, if there are any other subjects or stories or ideas you have that you think I should waffle about, please drop them below, and I may do so. And if you would like another bedtime story, I will leave the Storytimes playlist in the Dropbox below. And for now, I'm going to let you get on with your day or go to bed or whatever you would like. So thank you for listening. If you made it this far, you're probably asleep if you did, because this is a real waffle. So anyway, thank you for listening. Over and out. Bye-bye.